Right. All right, so you're probably thinking there's a lot more work that got done here than just brakes. Well, you're absolutely right. Had another situation of putting my nose to the grindstone, but fairly good reason for it. For now, let's go over what we were able to tackle. So the brakes are just baseline for now. We'll have to adjust the shoes once everything is properly set in place. I was able to finish the brake lines for the rear. I repositioned the hose. I had to unfortunately cut away a little paint to get the bolt installed in there for the proper T, but everything's properly supported. Get out of the way. Everything's properly supported, and once we get the shoes adjusted, we'll be able to fill it full of fluid and make sure that we have no leaks. And of course, the drums themselves were machined at a local shop. And of course, in the process of doing the front brakes, I was kind of jostling the tire around, and I noticed there was a lot of play in this kingpin, and this kingpin was kind of seizing up. The bushing on this spindle was almost completely missing from one side. Luckily, it didn't cut into the spindle steel at all. This side, it looked like the bushing got seized onto the kingpin and spun. And when it spun, it kind of dug into the brass and made the fitment really, really tight. So ultimately, I had to take the spindles off and replace the bushings, ream them out, and threw on some new kingpins and everything. So it works properly now. With the help of Matt over at Iron Trap, we were able to get the proper first and reverse gear for the transmission. Once we got the proper gear in our hands, we went ahead and blew the transmission apart, replaced that gear. We inspected all the bearings, everything seemed to be okay. So we repacked everything full of grease, replaced the seals and gaskets, threw it back together, painted it, and before we reinstalled, we threw a brand new clutch in there. We set the clutch equalizer in place just roughly. Obviously the pedals are a bit out of whack, We won't be able to really properly set them until we get the body on, so they're just gonna have to sit there like that until we get to that point. Once we were happy with the transmission, we went ahead and reinstalled the engine. While we were at Matt's, we went ahead and picked up this fuel pump. So we did a quick rebuild on that and got the proper pump rod. So that's still roughly installed. The intake's just kind of sitting there since we still got to figure out this pulley system in the front. So the next steps from here, first and foremost, is to figure out the drive shaft. I have a few irons in the fire to get the proper slip yoke and, you know, the proper procedure of getting the correct drive shaft built. Once the drive shaft is built, we'll be able to see if we need to do a transmission tunnel of sorts. Part of me thinks that we won't need to, but I'd rather know now than, you know, just kind of wing it. And then we're gonna have to figure out the radiator. I am kind of leaning towards the direction of just getting a brand new one, considering the amount of custom work that I think is gonna have to be done to it. Now, that's rather expensive, but if we gotta go that route, we gotta go that route. But we won't know until we get a few things tackled, so it's, you know, on the punch list. So ultimately, where the car sits right now is pretty much the goal I set for myself by the end of the year. The reason for the lack of content to kind of show every step of the way is I kind of got some nasty news. The radiation that I was put on after my chemo treatments in the beginning of the year didn't really do as well as they had planned. Just kind of the same story I got from the chemo the first time around this year. So ultimately the next step for me is to go back on the chemotherapy that I was on from 2016. It's a slightly different medication, and if memory serves me right, it beats me up much worse than the previous chemo I was on. So where I'm at mentally is I needed to get the car to a certain spot to, you know, do a couple of things. One, get my mind off of the horribleness that is this disease, and two, still be somewhat on track to have this car running and driving by the beginning of summer, hopefully. And as of right now, I think we're in a pretty good spot, you know, all things considered. So I was also fortunate to run down to Wildwood with my buddy John for the Race of Gentlemen this year. It's always an excellent show. This year was particularly really good. Ran into some old friends, saw some really excellent cars, and just overall had a great time. And it was a nice break from, you know, everything else that's been going on. In any case, I appreciate you guys following along. And as always, thanks for watching.